The next day, we met at the bus stop before school. Nick grinned when he saw me. It was an odd expression, all jagged edges and sharp points. I worked to hide my shiver of disgust. There was something wrong about the joy in that smile. "I have a present for you," he said and unzipped his backpack. "Close your eyes." I did what he told me to and put my hands out before me. After a moment of rustling, he said something heavy and glass in my hands. I opened my eyes. I was holding a jar full of cloudy liquid. The lid was smeared with blood, and inside floated 2 amber eyes that were horribly familiar. "Do you like it?" he asked eagerly. "They're just like yours. Now they are yours." I nodded numbly. I couldn't answer. I couldn't even breathe. That was the last time I talked to Nick. I threw the jar into a dumpster on my way home and promised myself that I would never even think about it again. From that day forward, I did everything possible to avoid Nick. I had only marginal success. The days of people watching together ended, but he was always still there. He watched me while I worked at the library or stared at me on the bus. Sometimes he'd follow me. Those were the days I wished I carried a knife. That was an excerpt from a short story I wrote when I was 15. It wasn't the most graphic thing I wrote at that age, but it was the piece of media that made me realize how deeply disturbing my fiction could be. The story as a whole follows a high school student named Amber, a blatant self-insert of myself, really, as she realizes that her bad boy boyfriend is a lot more unhinged than she first thought. In the scene I read to you, he gifts her a jar containing 2 real eyeballs, which she recognizes with a sinking clarity. In the scene directly before this one, the 2 teenagers have a beautiful park date. The weather is lovely, and it's overall an idyllic portrait of young love. As the day draws to the end, the 2 lovers find an old stray dog with clear amber eyes, the same color as our main characters. She frets about what to do with the dog. There's no way she'd be allowed to take it home, until her boyfriend kindly steps in and offers to take care of it. Take care of it. We don't see this scene play out in the text, but the implications are sickening. When I remember the reveal in the scene I shared, it still makes my heart sink a decade after I wrote it. It makes me feel sick, not to my stomach, but to something deeper. That was the first time I'd ever created something that made me feel so deeply. It didn't reflect a deep emotion that I had already been feeling. I had written plenty of emotional autobiographic fiction before that. Instead, it created an entirely new, very intense emotional experience. It was exhilarating to see that I could create something that painful and poignant. I wrote a lot at this age. I was always carrying notebooks at school, scribbling down ideas and scenes between classes, or sometimes in classes. It was very much a big part of my identity at that time. Writing was a passion and part of who I was, to the point that I attended a writers group on my school lunch breaks and regularly shared my new work with my friends. Having written this short story that felt so powerful to me, of course I wanted to share it. I passed it around for my friends to read first. I always got their feedback on my work before sharing it with anyone else. My friends told me immediately that I could not share this story with anyone else. I should tear it out of my notebook, tuck it into the back of my school folder, and leave it there. If anyone else read this, I would be sent to the school's counselor immediately. Something that had happened to me the first time the school year before, after a teacher flipped through some of my poetry. I took their advice, for the most part. I relegated the story to a folded over page in my notebook, something the sketchbook kids among my audience will relate to. I kept it to myself, and I kept writing. As I said before, that story was not the most gruesome thing I wrote as a teenager. In it, I fade to black before any graphic violence occurs. The dramatic moment then is the reveal, when both the main character and the reader learn that something horribly cruel has happened. Even then, the reveal happens quickly. It's a smear of blood, some cloudy liquid, and a moment of recognition. I didn't dwell on the act of violence that had been done, or on the gore or viscera that was implied. The shock of the reveal itself was what brought on that sinking feeling of revulsion that had been so exhilarating to write. I hid that story, but I chased the exhilaration. The next few stories I wrote did not fade to black so mercifully. I wrote my way through scenes of assault and murder, monster attacks and torture, with varying degrees of graphic detail, looking for the adrenaline rush of writing something truly horrifying. A lot of what I wrote as a teenager ended up the same way, folded over and tucked away. Most of it never made it out of that notebook. It was never shared and never copied, much less digitized. And now it's unfortunately lost to the sands of time. I never felt like writing these stories was a bad thing. I found it exciting to push the envelope of what I was able to write, both emotionally and from the standpoint of skill. It was cathartic and challenging, and I was always proud of the things I wrote. At the same time, I knew that if the wrong person read my work, it wouldn't be good for me. My writing would be held up as something wrong and bad, as proof that I wasn't okay. I'd likely have my notebooks confiscated and my creative efforts labeled as obscene or inappropriate. So, was it? In retrospect, was it wrong of me to write stories of violence and horror? Is there a point, generally, where it's wrong to depict cruelty in fiction? Or does it all just depend? Chapter 1, Manhunt. I've already been slightly disingenuous with you all. The implied animal cruelty was not the only reason why my friends objected to my short story. Before I tell you why, however, I want to talk about the name of the short story. To this day, I have 2 identical copies of this story saved to my laptop. The only difference is the file name. On one, the name is Eyes of Amber, an allusion both to the scene that I read you and to the story being told through the point of view of our main character, Amber. This is the original title and the one that I still prefer, for reasons I'll get to shortly. The second file is named False Hero, a title that refers to the end of the story. I gave the piece this name only after seeing that my friends all seemed to react more strongly to the ending than what I felt was the more thematically relevant midsection of the story. Let me explain. The longer Amber avoids Nick, the more unstable and obsessive he becomes. This culminates in Nick committing a mass school shooting, one that he offers Amber safety from if she promises to be his queen. She plays along just long enough to get the gun away from him, killing him before more people can be hurt. After a time skip, we see that Amber is being celebrated as a hero. The story ends, however, with her ruminating over the events, feeling like she's really just as bad as he was for having killed him. She's the false hero in this title. However, I feel like the overemphasis of this part of the story overlooks the theme of the story as a whole. To me, it's not a story about a school shooting, and it definitely isn't a story about wanting to commit a school shooting. It's a story about being the object of someone's obsession and feeling responsible for the abuse and trauma they put you through, because all of the bad things they're doing for you. Eyes of Amber is the more thematically relevant title then, because it emphasizes Amber as both our protagonist and Nick's object of obsession. The scene it refers to is also a key example of Nick doing something horrible for Amber, and her feeling both guilt and disgust because of it. Okay, let's talk about some writing that isn't mine. Believe it or not, I do read books. I watch movies too. I bought Manhunt by Gretchen Felker-Martin in the summer of 2022 while I was recovering from a hysterectomy. One of my exes had recommended it to me, saying she had absolutely loved it. She warned me, though, that it could be a hard read. If I was in the mood for a new take on trans storytelling and could handle some violence and gore, though, then I was in luck. It was a perfect recommendation for me at the time. Interesting enough to keep me entertained while I was stuck in bed, and celebratory of transness in a way that I really needed while I was recovering from surgery. That's really a major virtue of the book, by the way. So what's it about? Manhunt is an extreme horror novel with a fairly unique post-apocalyptic premise. A viral pandemic turns everyone with high enough testosterone levels into a violent, zombie-like monster who only exists, to put it bluntly, to murder, eat, and rape. The survivors of this pandemic are mostly cisgender women, along with a handful of non-binary people, transgender men, and transgender women, who have kept their testosterone levels low enough to avoid contracting the virus. Not even all cisgender women have been safe from this virus, as women with hormone disorders such as PCOS are at risk of catching it as well. The style of this novel is over the top. It is brutal, raunchy, and above all, disgusting. Felker-Martin does not shy away from giving us graphic depictions of violence, gore, and, importantly, illness. Just a few pages in, we're given this description of the standard progression of the virus. Oh, and if you're squeamish, you might want to skip forward to this timestamp. The plague, T-Rex, was as reliable as the atomic fucking clock. First, relentless hunger pangs, mood swings, fever, dermal fissures that wept pus and cloudy blood before scabbing over, bursting and scabbing again until the skin was nearly an inch thick in places. Delirium, intense spikes of aggression. Once the initial lava flow of symptoms cooled and hardened into the shrieking, ravenous things that seethed like lice across the entire American supercontinent, something clicked on inside whatever remained of the man's brain, and he started looking for something to rape, maim, and leave half dead like those wasps that laid their eggs in living tarantulas. The good news was that pregnancy was shorter now, much shorter. The bad news was that the babies ate their way out. This is not a book for everyone. This is a very particular book for a very particular audience. In the acknowledgments at the end of the novel, Felker-Martin describes her writing as splattercore. Splattercore is not a commonly used description of genre, but the related term, splatterpunk, is. Splatterpunk is a subgenre of extreme horror that is characterized by graphic depictions of gore and violence. It's primarily a genre of literary fiction, though the term is often applied to films such as the Saw or Hostel series as well. This seems to be caused by some degree of conflation between splatterpunk as a literary genre and splatter films as a film genre. Regardless, the critiques of fiction in these genres tends to be essentially the same. That they're morally wrong to create or consume, that they're somehow harmful to audiences, and that only people who have something wrong with them would possibly enjoy them. These are, at their heart, the same types of critique my friends and I feared would be lobbied against my own writing a decade ago. None of it leaves space to consider why someone might seek out this content, or how it might be good for them. The physical copies of Manhunt, or at least the edition that I have, feature a lot of praise on their covers, front, back, and inside. One blurb that stands out to me comes from Carmen Maria-Machado, who says, "Reading this book was like tonguing a live wire. I loved every moment, and I still haven't recovered." That struck me when I first read it. I think that was the feeling I was chasing when I was writing my short stories as a teenager. I think that is the feeling I'm still looking for when I reach for any piece of extreme horror, or really any type of media that gives me that shot of adrenaline. Horror media, whether I'm creating or consuming it, is my preferred way to thrill seek. Some people climb mountains, others try exotic or unusual foods. I read the most upsetting fiction I can find. At the base, all of these activities are forms of sensation seeking and can provide people with an escape from their daily lives and a sense of catharsis or release, as well as excitement. They also give people the opportunity to explore their own personal limits, which can be an invaluable way to learn about themselves and how they operate in the world around them. When I went into this project, I had a very clear goal in mind. I wanted to see if I could find a piece of fictional media, written or filmed, that I would find so vile and horrific that I would think it should not be allowed to exist. In other words, I went into this project wanting to push my own limits and find out exactly where they really lie. I did have some ground rules for myself. I was only going to look into completely fictional media. This means that anything based heavily on real events or real people wouldn't qualify. More importantly, anything that used real gore or showcased real abuse of animals or people would not count. At that point, it's no longer fictional, even if those acts or images are embedded within a fictional story. Unfortunately, if you're familiar with extreme horror, you know that, at least as far as film is concerned, that disqualifies a lot of the classics. As long as a piece was completely fictional, given my guidelines, I was willing to give it a go. Nothing was off limits in terms of kinds of violence, sexual content, or other graphic material. In this process, I've learned quite a bit about myself. For one thing, I've learned that films bother me much less than novels or short stories. My imagination seems to be much more vivid than any fake gore I've found. Furthermore, I found that I don't have any specific types of graphic content that bother me more than others. Though there are some things that I have a harder time taking seriously and staying engaged with. The main example of this is probably anything involving human excrement. Even when it is disgusting, it is rarely horrifying to me. Frequently it ends up skewing towards being either comical or feeling like it was written as poorly veiled fetish content. I know, however, that is my own subjective experience. Many people are, rightfully, horrified by content like that, as exemplified by the Human Centipede series. That aside, I have found some works that have made me feel absolutely awful. Things that repulsed me and gave me a feeling of shame and disgust that sat in my stomach like a ball of lead. I've read things that made me have to put the book down and walk away for a bit. I've had to reevaluate my goal in reading these things and ask if maybe there was something wrong with me for wanting to push my limits like this. There's been a couple of truly shocking scenes that I have seared into my mind's eye that I don't think I'm ever going to forget. But even with all of that, I haven't found any fictional media that I think is too obscene to exist. My original opinion still stands. If someone wants to make some horrifying piece of fiction, they should do so. If someone wants to engage with graphic material, that's their choice. In fact, I would go so far as to say that every horrifying thing I have chosen to read or watch has had an overall positive effect on my life. No matter how awful some of these things make me feel, they all brought me a type of pleasure. The pleasure of having my desire for horrifying media fulfilled. That in itself is a good thing. At least if you believe in preference hedonism. Hedonism is a philosophy that many people are at least vaguely familiar with. It gets referenced throughout popular culture, often not in the most flattering light. Simply put, hedonism is the idea that the only things that have intrinsic value are pleasure and pain. To live a good life is to live a life with more pleasure than pain. It is inherently a good thing, then, to pursue pleasure and avoid pain. Immediately, it would seem like engaging with extreme horror would be a bad thing under hedonism. Surely feeling scared or disgusted is closer to pain than it is to pleasure. If we take hedonism at face value, then seeking out horror must be a bad thing, right? That is where preference hedonism comes in. According to preference hedonism, it is not pleasure per se that is inherently good. It is having one's preferences or desires fulfilled, which itself is a pleasure. That explains how one could have a preference or desire for masochism, or painfully spicy food, or listening to sad music and having a good cry. Under preference hedonism, any time someone achieves a desired state, that is positive. When an extreme horror novel leaves me feeling disgusted, that is a positive thing, because that feeling of pushing my limits is what I was looking to achieve. This dynamic means that both creating and consuming extreme horror can be positive for the individuals doing so because they are fulfilling preferences that they have. For a video explanation of preference hedonism from someone who actually studied philosophy, because I didn't, please refer to my playlist. There you will find 2 videos about hedonism from PhilosophyTube. That is a great jumping off point if you want to do more research on the subject, because her explanation is clear and concise, and she always references key texts. Hedonism is clearly a very individual-focused philosophy. If I want to argue that something is good generally, I can't stop at arguing that it's good for me in my life. It isn't enough for me to say that I want to experience these intense emotions, so therefore creating or consuming fiction that creates these emotions is a good thing because it provides me with pleasure. Though I do believe that that in itself is true and is an important counterpoint to the critique that violent or gory fiction is inherently bad. We do need to look beyond the individual experience and consider more broadly how could this media affect more than just the individual. If we understand preference hedonism as the belief that an action is good when it allows someone to fulfill as many of their preferences as possible, then we can extend that belief outward to say overall an action is good when it allows as many people as possible to achieve as many of their preferences as possible. This way of thinking is essentially preference utilitarianism, or a utilitarianism of interests. As Peter Singer, author of Practical Ethics, describes it, utilitarianism based on interests differs from classical utilitarianism in that best consequences is understood as meaning what, on balance, furthers the interests of those affected, rather than merely what increases pleasure and reduces pain. In other words, the difference between classical utilitarianism and preference utilitarianism reflects that between classical and preference hedonism, but takes a viewpoint beyond the individual, providing a framework to evaluate actions generally. Clearly, graphic media fulfills preferences for various individuals, which is a positive thing. To determine if it is positive overall, however, we also have to ask, does the pleasure created by graphic media when it fulfills individual preferences outweigh whatever harm it might be doing? Are more preferences being fulfilled or thwarted by its existence? Well, what does it mean to cause harm? If you think that causing harm means that people who watch horror films or read gory books are more likely to go out and hurt other people, the evidence just doesn't back that up. A 2009 study published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics suggests that while violent films might increase aggression in the short term, this does not lead to an increase in violent crime. Laboratory experiments in psychology find that media violence increases aggression in the short run. We analyze whether media violence affects violent crime in the field. We exploit variation in the violence of blockbuster movies from 1995 to 2004 and study the effect on same-day assaults. We find that violent crime decreases on days with larger theater audiences for violent movies. I find it important to separate aggression and other things people may immediately feel as a result of graphic media from the actions that that audience might then take. Experiencing a strong or unpleasant emotion isn't itself a form of harm, especially if that feeling is what the audience was seeking out. Unless a clear negative effect can be shown, or a negative action is being taken as a result of engaging with this media, then there's no demonstrable harm being done. Often, though, the harm that horror literature is accused of is even less direct. Returning to Manhunt as an example, most of the backlash it has gotten has only peripherally touched on its gory style, using its splattercore dramatics as some sort of proof of the other harms it supposedly perpetuates. More than anything, Manhunt has been accused of being a call for violence against Harry Potter author J.K. Rowling. The plot of Manhunt follows 5 main characters as they struggle to survive the apocalypse. 2 trans women, a trans man, a cis woman doctor, and a cis woman who's a member of an extremely transphobic organization that is trying to establish itself as the government in the region. Because of this, we see a lot of violence between the transphobic organization and trans characters, as well as world building related to this dynamic. In a one-paragraph section of the novel, we're told about the unfortunate fate of a certain rich novelist. She has used her extreme wealth to hole up in a bunker, protected by security, effectively isolating herself from the apocalypse around her. That is, until a security guard carelessly knocks over a lamp, setting the whole complex ablaze. Trapped in the structure, the novelist burns alive. There are a few things to note about this scene. Firstly, I don't believe that the novelist in question is ever named as J.K. Rowling, though the resemblance is clear. I couldn't confirm this though, because when I was doing the research for this video, I simply couldn't find the paragraph this happens in, which leads nicely to my next point. This section is so short. I know it's in the novel. I remember it from when I read the book cover to cover for the first time, but I paged through the book multiple times trying to find it, and I just never came across it. This is not a detailed event in the story. It's just a passing mention of some event the main characters heard about. It's definitely not a graphic depiction of J.K. Rowling's death, especially when you compare it to the much more explicit descriptions of violence and injury that fill the book. Yet, supposedly this paragraph was somehow proof that the novel as a whole is a call to violence against J.K. Rowling, feminists, and women generally. I'm not going to go into this situation in depth because other people have covered it far more succinctly than I can within the scope of this video. For a full rundown of this particular controversy, I would recommend Jesse Gender's video essay, The Book That Murdered J.K. Rowling. It's included in the playlist I created for this video. However, I do want to emphasize a pattern that seems to be emerging. The reactions to my teenage writing and to Manhunt exist on two very different scales, of course. I'm not looking to compare my unedited, angsty short stories to the work of a highly praised, if controversial, published author. But I have noticed similarities in some of the reactions to these pieces. Particularly, people who are made uncomfortable by these works have a tendency to misdirect focus to a single aspect of the story, generally whatever they find most inflammatory or objectionable. In the case of my short story, that would be the role of a school shooting in the plot, whereas in Manhunt, it would be the wealthy author's death. In both cases, the focus completely overlooks the actual themes of the writing and ignores the fact that these are not stories about those events. Then, the graphic writing style of these pieces is used as an indictment of the writing as a whole and of the author or audience that enjoys it. This is how we get reviews of Manhunt accusing Felker-Martin of being a violent, mentally ill misogynist, as well as situations where high school students are afraid to let their teachers see their writing. In neither of these situations is the work in question causing demonstrable harm, yet it is vehemently attacked and demonized to the detriment of both creators and audiences. Chapter 2. Cows. As we've seen, the immediate response to graphic violence and gore in fiction is so frequently to demonize it as inherently wrong to enjoy or create. As a direct counterpoint to this, I argue that if we follow the logic of preference hedonism, the existence of these types of fiction is actually inherently positive, because its creation and consumption is a way for individuals to fulfill their preferences. Simply put, graphic and gory fiction is good because people want to read it, write it, watch it. If we then look beyond the individual and consider graphic or gory media in the context of preference utilitarianism, this media continues to be inherently positive as long as it allows more people to fulfill their preferences than it stops. This is a bit abstract, so to reframe it a bit, let's consider if this media is bringing about more positive effects, including providing enjoyment or satisfying desires, which are inherently good things in this framework, or causing more negative effects, demonstrable harm, including preventing people from fulfilling their own desires. Again, the question of demonstrable harm is a difficult one. It might be easy for us to look at the example from Manhunt and say, no, mentioning the death of a wealthy author is not the same as calling for violence. It does not cause demonstrable harm, but not every situation is as clear-cut. At what point does the existence of a piece of media cause demonstrable harm or interfere with individuals' ability to fulfill their preferences? If someone preferred for a piece of media not to exist, then does knowing it does exist constitute a form of harm that outweighs the preferences of the people who want to create and consume that media? That seems ridiculous, generally. But is it so far-fetched? It's important to recognize that just because something horrible is shown in fiction, it doesn't mean that the existence of that fiction is an endorsement of that act. Artists and authors can create media about things that they also find awful and don't think should happen in real life. This is one of the beautiful aspects of fiction, that it allows you to do that, to explore things that you would never want to actually occur. Furthermore, the depiction of horrible acts is definitely not the same as the act itself and shouldn't be judged as though it is. But how do we evaluate depiction? Patricia Taxon raises this question beautifully in her video essay on the ethics of boinking animal people, when she says, "A lot of people would say depiction is not endorsement, and I'm not here to argue against that, because it's true. Depiction is not necessarily endorsement, but depiction is an action that exists in the world and can be judged. What are you doing in the universe when you post a piece of hypno, age, kink, incest, erotica on Twitter? Well, you're not actually fucking your little sister. I think we can both agree on that. But you're doing something, right? So what are you doing when you depict horrible acts of violence? Is there a point where even if you enjoy creating the media you're making, and your audience would prefer to keep consuming it, it is simply too much to be reasonably portrayed? Cows, by Matthew Stokoe, is by far the most disgusting piece of fiction I have ever read. This novel requires a trigger warning for pretty much everything. Child abuse, animal abuse, sexual abuse, self-harm, murder, bestiality, bodily fluids of all sorts, and honestly, probably more things that aren't coming to mind immediately. Every paragraph is a new type of vile. I can't say that Cows has the most disturbing scenes I've ever read, but it does have the most horrific content with the least redeeming qualities. Everything else I've read for this project has had some aspect that helped counteract how horrible it was. Some things have had strong political or social messages that make the graphic content and violence feel like it's serving some purpose. Others have had moments of beauty or love that help to counteract the horror. Exquisite Corpse by Poppy Z. Bright is a great example of this. Even in the most graphic scenes of gore and bloodshed, the writing is so beautiful and heartfelt that it provides a counterpoint to the violence. Cows doesn't have that. Cows is just unrelenting misery from beginning to end. It's almost difficult to use Cows as an example, because short of reading you the book, there's almost nothing I can say to convey how horrific the experience of reading Cows is. From the very first page, it is blood, shit, and hopelessness, with no end in sight. It doesn't have the same problem of mischaracterization that Manhunt or my own writing faced, because there is no most objectionable part to pick out. The entire novel really is just like that. I'll describe the plot to you, but it doesn't do the novel justice. The main character of Cows is a young man named Stephen. He lives with his abusive and heavily controlling mother in a decrepit old house, along with his pet dog, whom his mother crippled with a brick before the story begins. Stephen is desperate to get out from under his mother's control and begin his own life, so he gets a job at a slaughterhouse, hence the cows of the title. What should have been his first step towards freedom, however, really just opened the door to his life getting a whole lot worse. Anything that I say beyond this point would spoil the plot for people who are interested, but suffice it to say that the horror is just getting started. Torture, murder, self-harm, bestiality, and rape all follow in quick succession. To really understand why this book is such a hard read, though, you need to experience the prose. This section is from early in the second chapter, only a few pages into the novel. Warning for animal cruelty. Skip to this timestamp if you need to. Stephen sat at the small, unbalanced table and watched dog drag itself across the sticky linoleum to the shit tray. Its useless hind feet swished sideways with each lurching four-leg step, like the tail of some broken fish. He'd had it from a pup, 9 years, and had been there, standing impotent and frozen, when the hag beast crippled it with a brick, for no reason at all. That day in his teens was confirmation of what he had suspected since birth, that he was incapable of manipulating life as other people did. Unlike them, he could have no effect on the web of events that surrounded him. He could bring about no change. Dog had looked up at him, not savage or pain-snarly, but confused. Like, how could Stephen allow this to happen? In those days, Dog was young and had not learned how powerless Stephen was before the beast. This atmosphere of hopelessness persists throughout the book, even when Stephen, through acts of extreme violence, manages to exert some power over the world around him. Between this oppressive atmosphere and the constant descriptions of every disgusting thing imaginable, this is not a pleasant read. It made me feel awful and disgusting the whole way through, heavy with dread and sick. I finished the novel, but many of the people reviewing it online can't say the same. Is this book too extreme? Too obscene? For many readers, yes. It's too much for them. But is it wrong for it to exist? Does it overall have more of a negative impact than a positive one? I don't think so. Reading it made me feel horrible. It was a deeply unpleasant experience. But that is a good thing. I wanted to push my limits, and this novel let me do that. It gave me that stomach-dropping feeling of dread that I was looking for. In my life, this novel, even with how disgusting it is, has been a net positive. This novel has made a lot of people uncomfortable. A lot of people have had to put it down or stop reading it entirely. It has put a lot of people into emotional states that they did not want. But readers always have the choice to put down the book. Being briefly disturbed when you did not want to be is not a lasting harm that could outweigh the positive effect on people who want to write or read a book like this. At least in the case of Cows, the worst piece of fiction that I have managed to find in months of looking, it is not too disturbing or too graphic to be depicted in fiction. So is there fiction that is so obscene that it shouldn't exist? I don't know. I haven't read or watched everything that exists, everything that has been produced, published, or not. No matter what, debating the morality of media is always going to be a subjective process, depending heavily on individual viewpoints and on what ethical framework you're looking to apply. Personally, I like preference utilitarianism. I think it makes sense. I also think it raises a lot of questions that I don't have good answers for, especially in regards to how we weigh preferences against each other and how we define harm. Is it a perfect system to judge media by? Probably not, but I don't think a perfect moral framework really exists. I do think it is a hell of a lot better than letting your knee-jerk emotional reactions dictate whether you think something is morally good or morally bad. Because this makes me feel uncomfortable isn't, or at least shouldn't be, a moral judgment. Feeling bad is not, in itself, a form of harm. So what do you think? How should we judge the ethics of depicting harmful, violent, or obscene acts in fiction? Have you read or watched anything that you thought went too far? If you've made it to the end of this video, thank you very much. Leave me a comment below to tell me your thoughts and feelings, or to recommend me your favorite piece of horror media. I want to give a shout out to both of my partners who helped with the script for this video, as well as to the instructor who let me create this video essay as the final for his class. For everyone else, if you enjoyed this video and want to see more video essays from me in the future, be sure to like and subscribe. You can also suggest future video essay topics in the comments. Please be sure to also check out the description for the playlist of related videos that I put together, as well as to the sources that I've cited in this video.